Welcome to the Transport Leaders Podcast, where we discuss the breakthrough ideas and bold solutions transforming the future of transport around the world. From system reform levers and political realities to sustainability and technological disruption, experienced transport professionals Graham McCabe and Russell King and their guests offer expert perspectives as we discuss ways to transform our transport systems.
Okay, Russell, what are we going to talk about today? Some of background.
This is a fun one today. Our very first podcast that we put out there was on Australia's high-speed rail project, and that was after the Infrastructure Australia had published their review of the business case, but we hadn't actually seen the business case. And now the business case has come out, and the government has pledged a whole load of more money
Yes.
to progress the project. So today it's kind of like an update on high-speed rail in Australia.
Yes.
And I think there's lots of lessons there,
Yeah.
not just for those in Australia, but also for those doing high-speed rail projects around the world.
It's a fantastic business case, isn't it? Isn't everything perfect?
Well, let's talk about the positives in here, I think, because I think there are a few compared to what we talked about last time. Okay, so let's focus on the positive to
So,
begin.
so this is So this is the document that we're talking about. That was just put up on the screen, and lots of very glossy pictures with meaningless facts, like the fact that there's high aircraft delays in Australia when we don't actually fly planes between Sydney and Newcastle. And lots of black bits because they're being redacted so that they don't affect the commercial value of the project.
Yeah, or stakeholder stuff as well. So there's a lot of blacking out around
Yes.
stations because they're going to have to acquire lots of land from existing landowners, and they don't want those landowners to be upset about it until they've actually talked to them first, which I completely understand.
Yeah.
And I don't think the reductions. Go on.
Oh, I was going to say, but the Australian Constructors Association is really happy with the project. Why? Why would people who build infrastructure be happy with a $90 billion project? Difficult question there.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff in here about stakeholders and whether people are supportive or not and who they are and all the rest of it. And I think there's some really big questions for us around governance on mega projects in Australia that is worth thinking about as well. I think it's also worth pointing out that although the business case at the front end is quite glossy, there is also a separate glossy document of about, I think, is it 20 pages, I think, which spruiks the project.
Yeah.
And I think it's very telling which are the bits that they are worried about, because those are the bits that didn't make the glossy. So you can almost tell straight away, and this will be the government rather than, I think, the High Speed Rail Authority. You know, this will be the politicians putting their spin on it, right? But they will have taken out some of the things they think are a bit, or maybe that's not the spin that we want to put on it, or that bit's a bit iffy. So you don't get things like the BCR in the glossy for some reason.
Why? It's a perfect project, isn't it? You know.
All right, come on, let's
120 kilometers worth of tunnels.
We're going to have
from Western Sydney to Gosford.
All right, we're going to have plenty of things to punch holes in about this project. Okay, but there are some positive things here. Okay. So tell
me one.
Okay, so one of the things we were worried about, quite rightly, we talked about it on our podcast to start with. We were worried that this thing was being rushed, okay, and that it was quite clear that the business case had been being rushed, and that principle of think slow, fast, which is sort of the standard sort of principle and philosophy that you should be going under with mega projects, was at that time not looking like it was being followed. But in fairness to them, they seem to have they have got money for planning, right? So they haven't sort of gone towards construction yet. So the next tranche of money is to do better planning around the project, which I think is a sensible step forward from where they were. If they'd have gone on and announced the project, I'd have been much more critical of this area.
I think the fundamental problem is that doing detailed planning on a bad project is still a bad project.
Yeah, we were looking for positives.
So saying we're going to do 120
here, right? I was trying to make sure let's get some positives and fairness, credit to people who have obviously recognized that challenge and have done something to try and do about it. Now, that's still maybe painting lipstick on a pig, right? Let's still, let's recognize that they are trying to do the right thing, because if this was a good project, this would have been the right thing to do.
Yes. But it still doesn't change the fundamental problem of if you've decided you're going to do 120 kilometers worth of tunneling, like a continuous tunnel of 120 kilometers, then having a well-designed 120 kilometer tunnel is meaningless. Like if you're going to have the most cost-effective 120-hour tunnel, well, good job by the tunneling engineers, but really, really crap job by the people who are determining what the project is.
Okay, I can see I'm not going to keep you away from the negative stuff. So let's talk to me about this.
No, it's just like it's the fundamental problem of scope capture is you are putting lipstick on a pig and you're creating the deepest possible trough for those pigs to feed at.
Okay, why is it a pig? Talk to me about why you think it's a pig. I think, interesting enough, we both agree that it's a pig, right?
Yeah.
But I think we will have different reasons as to why it's a pig.
Okay.
So go on. Why do you think it's a pig?
Okay. All right. Well, let's start at the basics. So, 72,000 total trips per day in 2061.
Yes, and to put that into context.
So that's
To put that into context, that's about a third of what Sydney's metro does on a daily basis. Okay, so in terms of numbers, it's not that big, and that's what metro does now, not what metro will do in 2071 or 2061.
Yeah. They seem to think that an operating subsidy of $30 billion over 20. What it'll be 30 years roughly is a good thing.
So is there an operating subsidy? I thought there was no operating subsidy.
No, there's an operating subsidy, and in fact, right at the front of the document, they talk about the operating subsidy that goes to the regular train service as a justification for having an operating subsidy.
In fairness, and I'm trying to be fair on this,
yeah.
There's no shortage of people who are public transport advocates who basically say public transport should be subsidized as a given, okay, and therefore, it shouldn't be criticized for being subsidized. I think the thing that gets missed is the reason that public transport is so heavily subsidized is partly because we so heavily subsidize the car. So we kind of have a zero-sum game against subsidies in different transport modes, right? So that's one of the problems. And I also think that we also end up with a whole bunch of, because public transport is predominantly in the public sector, we end up with a whole bunch of things that are very inefficient that the private sector would never do, which create operating subsidies. So, for example, we have a whole load of fare concessions that the private sector might not offer, but which the public sector politicians want to offer for particular audiences. So, for example, very cheap fares for pensioners. Okay, senior citizens discounts, those sorts of things. So they end up with quite a high proportion of users, especially on regional transport projects, which this arguably classifies as. So you end up with larger subsidies for that. And then I would also add on, because rail is very heavily unionized, you often end up with a lot of interesting working practices that, if left to be focusing on efficiencies, you perhaps would not have those working practices.
Yeah. So if your speed is your main priority, then people should be willing to pay a premium for speed. And it's very common around the world. And we've talked about this in the other episode of high-speed rail and the episode on public transport. Most high-speed rail services in the world have different fare settings for different speeds. So, if you want to take 10 hours to get from Tokyo to Osaka through the Japan Rail's normal services or even their limited express services, you can do that. Cost you about $30. If you want to get Kodama, which is the lowest level, which is the high speed rail, which stops at all the high speed stops, then it has a different fare. Then you go up to the Hikari, which has a different fare. Then you go up to the premium one, which is the Nozomi, which basically it stops twice in Tokyo and then Osaka. Stops in Shinagawa and then Yokohama. Remind myself, Yokohama is actually different prefecture and different area, even though it blends in with Tokyo. And that's very common around the world. So you pay more. So going from currently a $19.80 maximum fare cap in New South Wales to $62 save on a total return trip 3 hours is ridiculous. The rest of society should not be subsidizing.
So there's a pricing question, okay,
Yeah.
and what the right level of operating subsidy is should be. And I definitely agree with you on the
It was $31 Sydney to New, but and the type of housing that they're forecast. No. That's good because the type of housing that they're forecasting is of low value to high speed rail. So they're talking about downsizers. So, people who are heading towards retirement age, who have time, or, they're at a, status level within their industry or their jobs that they don't need to, commute to be in the office from 9 till 5. They're much more flexible in their working patterns. So, people with, grown up children who can commute off peak. So all their housing benefits are ascribed to people like you and me moving out to these locations. So, which then frees up miracle housing in Sydney for people who want to live where they have space for young children, and they're open about that. So the student from Cessnock or Singleton will now be able to commute 250 kilometres to go to university every day. Why are we encouraging super commuters? That's the opposite of addressing climate change. Yeah, it's also not delivering jobs outside of Sydney. So there's no reverse commuting as a result of this project. Well, you're just expanding the catchment of Sydney. You're not expanding the catchment of Newcastle. So, all right. Okay. So, okay, fundamental failure number 1. Fundamental failure 2. They are relying on European standards. European high-speed rail, obviously with the exception of, places like the Alps and Spain where you're getting up onto the, Madrid plateau, is generally built on the flat. So whereas Japan, South Korea, China, they're all built in mountainous and difficult terrain. So one of the interesting things about this business case is there are 0 mentions of China high speed, literally 0 mentions of a network that has 20,000 plus kilometers, 20,000 plus kilometers high speed rail. There's barely any mentions of Japanese high speed. So California's actually been through this. So they started off with European technical standards, and then they got a new CEO. And the new CEO said, why are you using European technical standards? Why don't we use the same gradients and curves that China uses? And they've identified hundreds of millions of dollars in savings just by looking west rather than east. Because, like how... Yeah. So this business case was what, $60 million. So, would have cost what, less than $1 million to do a study tour to China and engage some technical translators and look at the Chinese standards. Yeah. And I just went back into the document. There's literally 1 mention of South Korea, and that's in relation to the second longest high-speed tunnel in the world, which is 50 kilometers. They're proposing 119 kilometers worth of a single tunnel from Western Parramatta to Gosford. So twice as long as the longest rail tunnel, high-speed rail tunnel in the world. More than, not even close. 30. Yeah. Well, in their defence, it's 60 billion from Sydney to Newcastle, and another 30 billion to duplicate a metro line in Sydney. Yeah. I'm sorry if people see me smirking all the time because it's just how ridiculous this whole thing is. Yeah. So most of the forecast patronage is between Sydney, Parramatta, and Western Sydney Airport. It's not between Sydney and Newcastle. See, now you're smirking and laughing. So they've yeah. I mean, we're like, so to put it in scary context, a 200-kilometer route that at its terminus station in Newcastle in 2061 will have 6,400 persons per day using it. Now, some of their operational parameters, I just, every time I look at this document, I see something scary. Their operational parameters are 3-minute headways as their design, 20 trains per hour. They're only planning for a maximum of 10 trains per hour, train every 10 minutes, so 6 trains per hour. So 6 trains per hour in a 200-meter long train, single deck, because, God forbid we do like the French do and have double deck high speed. Because that would actually make the tunnels even bigger, and they're already got the tunnels small, so that they only run at 200 kilometers an hour. So when they get on the surface, they have to run at 320 kilometers an hour. So you can't have stops, because otherwise you don't get your politically mandated 1 hour travel time. So 6 trains per hour for 6,500 people per day is, in the peak hour. If you do your standard transport planning of 10 to 15% of people are traveling in your peak. So you have about 1 train's worth of demand per day, per hour in 2061 coming from Newcastle. So at the terminus point, and then you've got half again that at Morisset and Central Coast. So you've got about 2 trains worth of demand per hour, and they're going to run 6 of them. So this is going to be like Western Sydney Airport Metro. Yes. Port Macquarie to Brisbane was going to be the last stage of the previous studies. So you would maybe in the other direction from Brisbane. Port Macquarie to Ballina, something like that was going to be the last stage. So that bit in the middle. So you've got, the Canberra, Sydney, Newcastle corridor where there's demand for travel. You've got Ballina, Gold Coast, Tweed, Gold Coast, Brisbane, where there's a demand for travel. And then you've got Melbourne, if you go inland a little bit, Bendigo, Ballarat, Shepparton, Albury as your demand corridors. And then you've got big gaps in between. So if you're looking at, from an engineering perspective, given that we've never built high-speed rail before, they should be starting with the easy things, learning how to do it, building a commitment of long-term people who learn how to high-speed rail and then progress up and oversee later sections of it. That and that's how we did the Hume Highway and then the Pacific, was you had contractors, consultants, government employees who rolled from one project into the next. When the Pacific Highway between Sydney and Newcastle was upgraded, there was a Pacific Highway office who would have a project development team who would develop one project, and then they'd move on to the next project and develop that project. And then you have a delivery team, and you have the contractors, and they would all roll progressively. You don't go from, we've never done this before, to let's build a 90-kilometer long tunnel and 37 kilometers of bridges and viaducts, and have a 320-kilometer-hour target travel speed, and build it in 10 years. Like, we can't build 90 kilometers worth of tunnel in Australia in 10 years. Yeah. Okay. Well, do you want to keep talking about engineering challenges? Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes. No. So, okay. Being on traditional engineering, very unsexy. We start off by doing a whole bunch of curve easings and realignments. So you do your 320-kilometer-hour surface realignment, Goulburn to Canberra, and then you put the existing trains on that, and you ready it for upgrade. And then you do, you could probably even build Goulburn to Moss Vale at the same time. And then there's a little difficult bit south of Sydney, and then there's Sydney. So you knock the Sydney and Canberra time down to an hour and a half, and then you upgrade, So Japan, it's Shinkansen in the north and northeast. A lot of that is upgraded track, and there are sections where it runs on the same track as the local trains. So they have dual gauge sections. The tunnel between the mainland and Hokkaido is dual track and has freight trains running through it as well. So you can, absolutely. Yeah, it's like, new trains. So we have trains that run at 160 kilometers an hour in all of our states with regional rail services. They don't operate at that because the track's not up. Victoria used to run its trains up to 160, but they have levels with issues with train detection at level crossings and had some quite horrific crashes as a result. So they dropped the speeds. New South Wales has trains that can run 160 kilometres an hour. None of our tracks are up to it. Queensland does. Queensland actually runs its tilt trains at higher speeds than the other states. But again, like, doing, we used to do this. We used to do deviations to get around slow curves. A lot of the Sydney-Melbourne railway line is built on geometry from 1800s or up to the 1940s or 1950s when we stopped really investing in the infrastructure. So getting back to the demand. So Sydney Canberra has a bus, a coach that runs every 30 minutes at the moment, which shows you there's an all-day demand. The Federal Highway and flights as well. Yes, the bus carries the most passengers, and there's an all-day demand for driving. I mean, anyone only has to go to. I think it does. Yeah. 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 Pardon? Yeah. Yeah, and it's quite frequent. Yeah, it takes you into the centre of town. But obviously, the pollies and the business people going down there for meetings and things, take the 30-minute flight plus the time at the start and the end. So if you have a fast rail service that takes you CBD to CBD, or finishes somewhere in the Parliamentary Triangle, then you've got latent demand that can easily be moved. Sydney to Melbourne is a bit more of a challenging one, just because of pure time. It's right in that time trade-off where, your door-to-door time, Sydney CBD to Melbourne CBD by plane is probably about 2.5 to 3 hours. And, with a train that bypasses Canberra, you're probably looking at 4.5 to 6, hours. So it's not a commuting service. So yeah. But what we don't do with high-speed rail, and there has been a couple of proposals, is we'll put in a high-speed rail station, but I'm sorry, Mossvale, for picking a random country town. You now get 100,000 people. You get connected to Sydney in 20 minutes or half an hour, but your trade-off is you get this population. And I remember when I was talking to a local council in Sydney about Metro, and they're like, and our transport strategy, has to have this metro line that the government's identified off in the far future. And I'm like, okay, well, there'll probably be a station here and here, and with each of those stations comes 20,000 residents. And I'm like, but we don't want that. It's like, well, you don't get the metro. Because if you want the metro, you have to accept the residents that come with it, because they're the ones that pay for it in the long term through that economic uplift and the additional housing and services. So just to your point around, we're not even putting increased density around the stations in Sydney. I think one of the fundamental flaws of this project, in addition to all the other ones, is they're not even using the existing railway stations to support this project. So you have 20, 30 railway stations that could be supporting this project and feeding passengers into this line, but then they're putting the stations away from the existing rail network, particularly with the Morisset station, probably being further inland from the existing station. And so you can't even they're not even putting density around those stations in order to feed people to this line.
Yeah, I can't help but feel that although this is, a high-speed rail project, the best high-speed rail projects are going to deliver benefits well beyond the travel time savings that the high-speed rail delivers. They're effectively integrated transport and land use projects, right? So you're either connecting two significant cities typically together, and by doing that, you're creating opportunities for people to live in one and work in the other.
Yes.
And you see that very successfully with high-speed rail across the world, right? But the problem with this stage of the high-speed rail project is it's not connecting to significantly sized cities. It's connecting Sydney, which is a significantly sized city, with Newcastle, which is what, population of 180,000 and heavily dispersed, very low density. So it's not even though
Yes.
it's a concentrated 180,000, they'll all be able to access the high speed rail station really easily. That is not the scenario we're looking at here. So because of that, it feels like it's trying to be both a transport and a land use project and failing at both, right? Because it's not delivering huge amounts of patronage on transit that you go, wow, that's amazing. And that's proved in the business case, right? The travel time
Mm.
savings are small in terms of the benefits of the business case. So what's happened is as a result, it's come out on housing as the single biggest driver in terms of benefits for the project. And lots of people with Spirit High Speed Rail talk about, how its ability to disperse outside of our cities, but it doesn't tackle the realities of our cities, which is they are very low density. There's lots of potential for building new rail lines and more stations on existing rail lines in our cities and building the housing around them and delivering much, much larger amounts of housing, much better economic returns for much lower cost than the 90 billion. And
Yeah.
that fundamentally for me is why strategically it doesn't stack up. You can do a lot better for 90 billion. If you're that 90 billion is just being spent in the Sydney Newcastle corridor, right? You could spend a few billion on expanding the Newcastle light rail and building housing around the extension of the light rail project and making that more valuable as a network, and then build some additional rail lines in Sydney.
Yeah.
And for that 90 billion, you'd probably build two significantly sized new metro lines in Sydney, right? And build a whole load of housing around them. All right. So you could go down to, for example, La Perouse, which would be a really good place for, has been on the strategic list for
Mm.
metro for a long period of time. And you could do something out in Western Sydney as well for that sort of money. And you could probably build two or three significantly, light rail projects in Newcastle itself to help connectivity within Newcastle, which would deliver vastly more people into the
Mm.
Newcastle CBD. And if you put housing around them, would significantly provide more housing. For
And
me,
yeah,
I mean,
uh,
that's, just that opportunity cost for me is and that's what should have been compared against, right?
well,
Because this is a transport and land use project, not a transport project. It should be compared with alternative transport and land use projects, comparing it against upgrading the road along the Sydney Newcastle corridor. It's just the wrong comparison.
well, then they haven't even compared it properly against the existing railway line. Like, so, if okay, well, you want to get like, aside from following the grade in tunnel between Sydney and the Hawkesbury River, and then not having any stops in northern Sydney, in order to go under the river, to then follow the grade under the hills on the northern side of it. Like, there's normal rail engineering things that you could do that would improve travel time significantly. That would cost less than 1/10 of that cost.
Why do you think they got stuck in? Do you think it was because they had a kind of has the 1 hour driven that and the desire for speed as a consequence, and so providing much better cost effective upgrades but with slightly slower speeds just didn't meet the political imperative for the 1 hour?
So when you look at their alignment options, it feels very much like they're trying to stay off the surface because they've decided that tunnel is easier unless there's nobody around. So one of the it's like renewable energy. One of the big challenges with high speed rail is this thing passes by my house, but I receive no benefits.
Yeah. And in fairness, this was a major challenge at high speed rail in the UK,
Yeah,
right?
and the
And
and the and the US and
yep, and the
yeah,
California high speed rail, absolutely, right? Both
yeah,
of these have
yeah.
suffered from this. And the problem they then end up with is they've ended up making endless compromises, which have added to the cost and delays because it's like, oh, the
Mm.
community is unhappy with this high speed rail going through their community, therefore we'll put it underground or we'll reroute it, etc. And in fairness to them, they're not going to have that problem on this project, right? Because they're
No.
tunneling pretty much everywhere. And when they're not tunneling, it's bridges. So they're not going to have that problem. So in a sense, if the reality is they didn't think they were going to be able to build at grade,
Mm.
okay, as a realistic option, okay, because the stakeholders would just make it impossible, then they've probably chosen to model the better option, right? Which is rather than be optimistic and hope that, politicians are willing to, tolerate extensive criticism from stakeholders at grade, right? They've probably made the right choice and said, okay, we'll go underground. What for me then hasn't happened, and this is because the project was was being steamrolled through, is to go, well, if we're going to have to spend all this money, $90 billion, not $30 billion, does the strategic case for the project still stack up? And the answer is no, it doesn't, right?
Yeah.
Because if the project costs 30 billion, right, so a third of the price, your costs are reduced by 2/3. BCR is going to be much healthier. And as Infrastructure Australia quite rightly pointed out, they're optimistically getting to sort of 0.8 to 1. And that's the optimistic version, right? And we know that these projects always overrun on budget, right?
Yeah.
And maybe they'll deliver significantly higher benefits than are currently being estimated. Sometimes that happens.
Yeah.
But realistically, you want, but if you're going to be, oh, well, we'll ignore the business case, whatever, anyway, then don't spend hundreds of millions of dollars on business cases, right?
Yeah.
You don't need to if you're going to make the decision anyway.
Yeah. Well, and the really silly thing is, even though they're not going to have any stops on the existing alignment, they generally follow it between Sydney and Gosford. And it's like, yeah.
Well, there's a good reason why it existed in the first place, right?
Yeah, yes, but that involves tunnels and bridges and yeah, yeah. So you said there's some good things to come out of this. To wrap it up, the think slow, act fast approach, but I think that runs into what we were talking about around the number of people in industry who are dependent on government, so aren't then willing to say, well, you might be thinking slowly, but you're actually thinking about the wrong thing. So
yeah, I think one of the big unknowns for me is this is a long-term build, right? And based on historical norms, okay, and we are in uncharted territory politically, but based on historical norms, the current flavour of government is not going to be sustained throughout the entire construction period of this project.
Yeah. Yes.
Right. And so one of the questions for me, which I haven't seen yet, and we've had a change of leader in the opposition political party recently, is what their view on the project will be, and whether they will be supportive or not. Because if they come out and they are not supportive of the project, for me, you shouldn't be proceeding anyway, unless there is a political consensus around the project, okay, so that you can cope with changes in government. You do not want to proceed on this, because otherwise, the government's going to come in and go, right, I want my options for cancelling this thing, and let's get it cancelled and let's spend that money elsewhere. And we've seen governments across Australia spend a lot of money to cancel projects, right, and cancel contracts, right. And so, that is, for me, a realistic possibility that we end up with spending billions and billions of dollars, and at the end of those billions of dollars, somebody goes and pulls the plug, and we never get the benefits from those, because those are sunk costs that we'll never get back.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it's a realistic.
The longest rave venue in the world.
Yeah. And let's be frank about it. California is looking more and more like that in their high-speed rail, right? They're continuing to build, but they don't have the money to complete it. They have no idea how they're going to fund it. And they're basically, what they're hoping is there'll be a change of president in the White House who will then grant them a whole load of money.
Well, that and the courts will side with California that, well, the government was you can't just unilaterally cancel the project, cancel the funding for them.
Yeah.
Because it's still there. It's still legally funded. It's just that the current administration has said, well, we're not giving you any of the money.
Yeah. And what I imagine will be, so I can see the court saying you haven't followed due process to provide the money, to cancel the money, right? But I think that there'll be a process they'll put in place. Or go, this thing is over budget, behind schedule. It's poor use of federal funding. Now we're no longer providing the funding for it. And I think it's very hard for, I know legal expert, etc., constitutional expert. I'm sure it'll end up at the Supreme Court. But it's very difficult to see a situation where if the federal government provides a certain amount of money under certain conditions, and those conditions are not met, typically, which is the budget's blown out, the timescales are blown out, right? That the feds don't have a power to go, yeah, we're not going to put good money after bad, right? So, but
it was a line item in the infrastructure bill, so yeah.
Yeah.
So you actually need Congress to act to decide to withdraw the funds. So
Uh,
yeah.
Well, we shall see whether they
Yeah.
do it
Mm,
or not time. All
mm.
right. Well, I think we're basically, so the conclusion is we love the high-speed rail project in Australia. Please build it. It will be fantastic for this country. It's exactly the right thing to do. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Please don't push.
You know that's the bit that I'm clipping to put in the teaser.
I know. Genuinely think, I think it's a sad state of affairs. It's a sad predicament, an indictment of our governance in Australia that this project is continuing at pace with very little pushback and very little resistance when it has such big flaws and such obvious flaws to the point where even its own government departments like Infrastructure Australia have provided significant critique of what is being proposed. I think it's sad and it's not a good place for us to be as a country when we're already struggling for, sort out our transport problems and our economic problems and our housing problems, right? It feels like this $90 billion is a good opportunity to improve transport, improve productivity, and improve housing across Australia, and we were going to blow it.
Yeah. Yep. I think that's a great spot to finish for today. So, thank you, Russell. Thank you, anyone who's listening. Hopefully this recording is a bit better than previous ones. We've changed, giving a new platform a go. And if you'd like to help support us using a better platform, please feel free to buy us a train or a bus ticket, not high-speed rail prices, over on Patreon. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Graham. See you soon.
Thanks.